Good evening. Can you hear me? It's not so important if you can hear me, but it's more important that you can hear our speaker tonight. So that's the reason I tested. It's okay? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Board of Trustees of the Leer Jerusalem Institute, I want to welcome you with a warm welcome here tonight. And I think it's appropriate to say a special welcome to Professor Daniel Kahneman, and we are pleased and honored that you have accepted to be our speaker tonight. In following with the Institute's proclaimed goal of academic excellence and public exchange of ideas, we present the 7th lecture in the Oscar van Leer annual Memorial Lecture Series. These lectures were inaugurated in 1996, following the passing away of Mr. Oscar van Leer, who gave clear focus to the philanthropic aims of the Van Leer Group Foundation. The Van Leer Group Foundation aims to contribute to the development and strengthening of a Jewish, democratic national home in Israel, committed to a free, equitable and just society for all of its citizens and the pursuit of regional peace, and to benefit a better social, cultural and individual lives in this country. To this end, the Van Leer family established the Leer Institute, the Jerusalem Film Center and Doker International Limited. The Jerusalem Film Center, which was founded in 1973, now consists of the Israel Film Archive, the largest film archive in the Middle East, the Jerusalem Cinematheque and the Jerusalem International Film Festival, which celebrated its 20th anniversary this year. The center is a tribute to pluralism, dialogue, coexistence, cooperation and the quest for freedom. Doker International represents the business investment of the Van Leer Group in Israel. Doker's vision is to contribute to the welfare of the Israeli economy and society by investing in companies that have activities in Israel and are based on high technology developed in this country. The Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, since its inception in 1957, combines theory and practice. The Institute is involved in academic intellectual research on the one hand, as well as running educational projects in schools. Recently, its emphasis has laid in studying the Arab society in Israel, the creation of a common core curriculum, and investigating issues of social justice in this country. The Van Leer Group Foundation has demonstrated its long commitment to the Van Leer legacy in its generous support for this institute. This year marks the first anniversary of its return to the refurbished institute site. The Van Leer Group Foundation have invested in bringing the institute into the 21st century with what we, if we may say so, state-of-the-art technology. I would like now to invite Dr. Shimson Zelniker, head of the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute for the past 6 years, to introduce our speaker tonight, as I said before, Professor Daniel Kahneman, winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics. Again, very welcome on behalf of the Board of Trustees.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. תודה לכולכם. אני בעוד כמה שניות צריך לעבור לאנגלית, אבל נעים לי מאוד לארח את האורח, לראות את כולכם. I want to thank the board of the VLJI, the Van Leer Group Foundation, members, those who are present, of the Jerusalem Institute, the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and all the representative of all the branches of the entity called Van Leer. I want to welcome this important audience. I want to thank the people that labored really very hard, to make this evening possible. And above all, I want to thank and welcome our guest who was willing, to grace us with his wisdom and presence. Before I proceed with my brief remarks, and they will be brief, I would like to acknowledge Professor Nehemiah Lefzion, who not 3 weeks ago had passed away. He was my predecessor in this institute, contributed greatly to the well-being of the institute, and was a major figure in higher education in this country. I see many people who knew him very well, some who knew his work, and his presence still fills these halls. You join me, I hope, in silent prayers for him, and I say, Yehi Zichro Baruch. Although it is most tempting, it would be futile to try and cover Professor Kahneman's full scope of academic and intellectual achievements. I will not try such undertaking tonight. In a quick search that I conducted on the internet the last few days, I found dozens and dozens of pages and links related to his work. A recent bibliography of his work that I got, which is a partial bibliography, lists about 150 books and articles that were published until very recently, and some 60 items that are in press. So it would be futile to cover all of that. In addition, I feel that aside from the volume and scope of the work that defies coverage, I also suspect that, Professor Kahneman may have had enough of these lengthy introductions. Indeed, the spontaneous outpouring of public love and pride in his accomplishment and his Nobel Prize is threatening to drown him. So I will spare him with a very brief introduction. For people like myself, who were students at the Hebrew University in the 60s, Daniel Kahneman was an admired figure and a hero. He and Amos Tversky, together with a group of young PhD students, were the true intellectual avant-garde for us. They were the recognized heroes of undergraduate aspirants like myself. Their talent defied disciplinary borders. On one day they advocated a political position, the next day they engaged Professor Leibovitz in a big debate, and the third way they presented a paper on philosophy and psychology. They were awesome. There was little doubt even then that their talents will be recognized well beyond the local boundaries of Israel. When their work started indeed to become known and grow international acclaim and recognition, it came as no surprise to most of us. The surprise, if any, was in the degree of goodwill and benign acceptance with which their successes were accepted in the Israeli intellectual community that is not known for its benign acceptance. As said, Professor Kahneman's work straddles a wide and challenging range of issues, from perception, attention, to decision-making, to social justice theory, and to philosophy. They are all defined by a basic irreverence towards hegemonic theory, and by a very sharp and practical eye that deciphers actual human behavior from theory. The Royal Swedish Academy chose to reward that part of Professor Kahneman's work that, I quote, demonstrates how human decisions may systematically depart from those predicted by standard economic theory. Using, again, his sharp eye and employing good old-fashioned common sense in a highly formalized and theoretical domain, Professor Kahneman shows how people, more often than not, act irrationally. For those of us with a Jewish mother and with an experience in Middle Eastern politics, that may sound rather banal. But the sharp departure from the rational man model deals and dealt a major blow at the very heart of social science theory as it was constructed and defended from the beginning of the 20th century. The topic of Mr. Kahneman's talk tonight is the psychology of large mistakes and important decisions. It is a scintillating and I think enigmatic topic. Personally, I was rather surprised at the title. Why does it begin with large mistakes and is followed by major decisions? Normally, large mistakes follow major decisions. Well, I leave it, I leave this enigma to Professor Kahneman to unravel tonight. For my part, I would like to end with an observation. It is a fact that decisions, large, important, and minor, are a species that seems to disappear from the Israeli scene. Israeli national leaders are anything but decision makers. They voluntarily run for office. They are often very educated, not very often, and determined individuals who believe themselves to be leaders of people, but they never or very seldom decide. They govern by avoidance, by neglect, and by inertia, and not by decision. Unfortunately, the avoidance of major decisions in itself is no guarantee against major disasters and mistakes. Who will save us from non-deciders? Maybe Professor Kahneman in the short term, God in the long term. I am very delighted to invite, Professor Kahneman,
Take me a minute to get ready here. Well, thank you for the introduction. It was long, actually, but I enjoyed it. Thank you very much. It is truly an honor to give a lecture named for Oscar van Leer. It was actually an honor to know him, and before that, to know his very impressive mother, whom I was fortunate enough to meet in the late 1960s. I often met Oscar van Leer with Yehuda Elkanah during the years in which the Van Leer Institute became a unique institution in Jerusalem, with a character all of its own, and at the time, a true innovation on the Israeli scene, and I think a very important development in Israeli intellectual life. Now, as everyone here knows, the work for which I was honored last year was done jointly with Amos Tversky in a collaboration that started in 1969. And Amos and I spent a very important year in the Van Leer Institute, so I know this place very well. We were given an office and free access to cookies and instant coffee that was available here. And we spent the year writing a paper that turned out to be quite an important paper in our study of judgment and decision making that we published in 1974, which reviewed our early work on judgment. We spent our days talking, many hours every day for many years. This is what we did, and it was very enjoyable. And of course we talked a lot, not only about work, but we talked a lot about the events of the day. And the events of the day actually informed our thinking about judgment and decision making. There was never a very sharp separation for us between the experimental studies in which we engaged and our thinking about the real world and real events, large and small. In 1973, a few months before the Yom Kippur War, I gave a talk here about possible implications of the psychology of judgment and decision making to strategic decisions. Now, almost miraculously, for anyone who knows me, a transcript of this has survived. Now, it recently turned up among my papers, to my astonishment, and I no longer know exactly where it is in the papers, but I did read it at the time. And I was impressed by how much we knew then, and also by how much we have learned. That is, a lot of things that I thought we discovered since or found out since we actually knew because they were there, but there are certain things that I can date that we didn't know and that we have learned and that are relevant to the 1973 topic. So when I was invited to give this lecture, it seemed exciting to review what we have learned since that time. And this is what I will do very briefly today. I should say immediately that I'm really not an expert on strategy. I mean, the way to, touch many topics is a dilettante, and this is what I am. My field is psychology. I do experiments, and I speculate about many things beyond the experiment. And what I'll be doing today is speculating. All I'm able to do responsibly is set out some hypotheses that are based on experimental research and that I believe have applications and sort of get confirmed when you're a regular reader of the daily news. So let me outline what this is going to be about. The structure of the field today, or the field that I'll talk about, is really the same today as it was 30 years ago. And I'll distinguish three sets of players. The rational choice theory is still the central theory. We haven't struck a mortal blow to this theory. It's a central and dominant theory of social science. It is a logical model of decision-making, and it is also used as the foundation of economic theory. That is, the assumption that economic agents are rational is the foundation on which most economic theory is built. Now, the rational model assumes that people choose actions that optimally reflect their desires and values and their beliefs about the world. Now, that's one group of people, and actually I won't say very much about the rational decision model today. I'll talk about another group of people who are experts in a field, in a technical field called decision analysis, and this is an applied field. And decision analysts define standards for reasonable decision-making, actually borrowing the standards from the rational agent model, but decision analysts realize that people do not spontaneously act like rational agents, and that when they are making important decisions, they might need help. And the topic and the function of decision analysis is to provide such help. Now, they do this by offering a systematic approach to the evaluation of options in important decisions. That is, and the evaluation of these options has two aspects. One of those is the probabilities of different outcomes, what will actually happen if we make this move, if we select this option, what are the possible outcomes and their probabilities. And the evaluation also means the assignment of values. How much do we hope for or desire or fear the various outcomes? Now, the third set of players, those are psychologists who sort of look both at decision analysis and at the rational model, and Amos and I were the third players in this. Now, we thought, and I still do, that the rational agent model, as it is often applied, is really not a realistic description of how people actually think and decide. Not everybody agrees with that, but I will assume this. Our work was concerned with attempting to specify the ways in which people depart from the rational model. And we also attempted to provide an explanation of these departures in psychological theory. But today, I'll be mostly concerned with the relationship of psychological research to decision analysis. Now, 30 years ago, when Amos and I were drinking coffee and eating cookies here and walking all over Jerusalem while talking about politics mostly, we accepted the prescriptions of decision analysis. And we thought that the way that decisions are made by individuals and by organizations could certainly be improved. We believed that in important decisions, people might be able to replace, at least in part, intuitive judgment of outcomes and intuitive evaluations of outcomes by a more formalized and more systematic computation. That is basically the assumption on which decision analysis is built. And I think I have changed my opinion about this. I'm now a lot more pessimistic than I was about the possibility of actually reforming decision-making by the application of systematic thinking. And in part, what here is sharing the reasons for that pessimism. Now, it is a fact that decision analysis has not taken hold. I mean, 30 years ago, when Amos and I knew many decision analysts, and and respected their work, which I still do. But there was also the sense that we had that the work might take hold, that it might become a practice for large organizations and for governments and in strategic decision-making to apply the methods of decision analysis, that is, to very formally try to analyze the possible outcomes of options, their probabilities, and their values. This just hasn't happened. And I now believe that there are very solid reasons for this failure of decision analysis to take hold. I mean, we were in some ways, I think, naive about what happens in organizations, naive in believing that organizations could be reformed simply because rationality demands that they should be. Now, we've also learned quite a bit about the ways in which intuition and motivation depart from the rational model, and I'll be folding some remarks about what we have learned into my comments. On one thing, I think we were convinced then, and I'm still convinced now, and this is that the quality of large decisions is not necessarily higher than the quality of small decisions. That is, it is a myth in some places, in some quarters, that when the stakes are high, the quality of thinking goes up. I think the newspaper actually provides a great deal of evidence against this belief, and my sense is that it may actually, in many situations, it's the other way around. That is, it's the small decisions, the repeated decisions, where a routine can be established, where learning from experience is possible, where rationality ultimately can prevail. But important decisions tend to be unique, and because they're unique, there is very little learning from experience, and I will analyze later some of the reasons why, which enable us, I think, to avoid learning from experience. And we're very, very good at that. Now, decision analysis is built on a model which is borrowed from the rational agent model, in which decision-making is viewed as a choice between gambles. So basically, any option that people consider taking is viewed as a gamble. And the reason it is viewed as a gamble is straightforward. People never have full certainty about what will happen. I mean, even if you do one of the most certain things, you buy an apartment, you don't really know what's going to happen to real estate values, and indeed you don't even know whether, there's going to be a child learning drumming in the next door apartment. So there is uncertainty in everything that we do. And that uncertainty, the element over which we have no control, turns every option into a gamble. Decision analysis took that, and they decided basically to train institutions, train organizations, to look at their options as gambles, and to try to analyze the gambles formally and as precisely as possible. Now, once you're committed to an action, and that's the idea, and you do everything that you can do to control the outcomes, there is still an element that is beyond your control. That element is irreducible uncertainty. About that you can only have probabilities, and this is going to be extremely important in specifying the values of options. So, notice that when we talk about a gamble in this way, this also touches on terminology that is standard in philosophy, that we're talking about beliefs and desires. The probabilities in this analysis correspond to our beliefs, and the values that we attach to outcomes correspond to our desires. Now, in the standard example, decision analysis was really formalized for business, for large business decisions. Organization that is deciding whether or not to invest in this project or to make a particular acquisition, and doing this as a gamble and not doing it as a gamble. And to follow on the remarks of Dr. Zelniker, in decision analysis, not acting is an option, and you analyze the uncertainty associated with not acting in exactly the same way as you analyze options that involve taking active action. And the idea of decision analysis was to formulate an equivalent gamble. Typically, they would reduce everything to money, which is possible, maybe possible for business decisions, and they would say, well, ultimately, given all the uncertainties, taking that option is as if you were gambling on the possible outcomes, attaching a given probabilities to what the state of wealth of the organization is going to be, say, 5 years from now, or you could work it back to the present by working the interest rate backward. What is the value of each option now? And it's a probability distribution over financial outcomes. So that was the general idea. Now it's fairly straightforward, actually, to transform this, to apply a very similar model to strategic decisions, or say to decisions that involve the state of Israel. One could consider possible outcomes of different options, and one could then try to assign values to these outcomes. First probabilities, and then possibly assign values, and then one could see how various actions that are possible, including no action at all, what are the probable consequences of different actions. Now, in principle, the way the decision analysis was formulated, in an organization, there would be division of labor. And the division would be between experts and decision makers. The experts would be responsible for the probability side. That is, they are supposed to be able to figure out what are the possible outcomes and their probabilities from their understanding of the system, whether it's the economic system, the technological uncertainties, or the political system. The decision makers in the idealized model of decision analysis have really two functions. One of them is a managerial function, that is, they control the way that, among other things, expertise is generated within their organization. But the other, and that is the crucial function of leadership, is they're the guardians of the values. That is, they determine what are the possible trade-offs in complicated situations where there are multiple outcomes and things cannot be reduced to a single price. They determine the real costs and benefits of various outcomes. So that's the idealized model. And it sounds simple, and it sounds compelling. And I have no doubt that, in an ideal world, this is the way the decision should be made. There should be experts who dispassionately evaluate the probabilities of outcomes, and there should be people who very seriously think about various trade-offs. But that, it turns out, is not the way that people think about decision-making at all. Decision makers absolutely reject this model. And Amos and I were very impressed during the years of our work, the formative years of our work in Leer. We were very impressed by examples from the daily paper. And I'll remind you, well, the audience here, many of you will remember, many of you are too young to remember. One example that impressed us was from an article in Time magazine when Nixon decided to bomb Cambodia. And Time magazine had the following sentence, which I can still remember because I was shocked by it, being impressed by decision analysis. It said, Nixon has taken a great gamble, a large gamble, and only history will tell whether it was a mistake. Now this violates the basic logic of decision analysis. When you take a gamble, whether or not it is a mistake is, to the extent that it's knowable at all, is knowable now, because you evaluate the gamble on the basis of the best information that you have now, and the fact that it works out badly does not mean that it was a mistake, and the fact that it works out well does not mean that the decision was good. So there is a fundamental difference between the way that we think about decisions and the way that decision analysts think about decisions, in that we tend, and all of us tend, to be extremely impressed by outcomes in evaluating the quality of decisions, good or bad. And that already violates decision making. And here is another example which we were quite impressed by. Many of you will remember, and some, and all of you know, I think, that at a certain time in the early 1970s, I forget the exact date, the Israeli Air Force downed a Libyan civilian plane. And this was the story, as it was described by the Chief of Staff on the evening of that event. And I remember it almost verbatim, because it was so impressive. He described the plane was flying into Israeli airspace, seemed to be headed directly towards nuclear installations, towards Dimona. Clearly was not to be allowed a strange plane to fly to Dimona. The Air Force was scrambled. They tried to make contact. They were worried. The pilots were worried. It did not look like a military plane. It was just flying very steadily, as it turned out, on the wrong course. They tried to signal it. It could not exactly respond to signals. And the Chief of Staff described the agony that they went through thinking about this. And then he used the following, okay. At a certain point in time, the plane turned directions and started flying back to Egypt. And it was about to cross into the Egyptian border, and the Chief of Staff said, and at that point, we decided that it was an enemy plane, and we gave the instructions to down it. Now, you're not supposed to decide, if you're into decision analysis, you're really not supposed to decide about the state of the world. There are, from the vantage point purely theoretical in decision analysis, what is the idealized way to think about it? Well, there are two basic outcomes that you're extremely worried by. One is downing a civilian plane, and clearly this was on their mind. The other is a danger to a nuclear installation, and clearly that was on their mind. And now there is a trade-off between these two dangers, and there are probabilities assigned to these two dangers, and it's somehow the trade-off between the values and the trade-offs between the probabilities that will ultimately determine what course of action should be taken. That is absolutely not the way that things were done. Notice what happens. When you decide on a state of affairs, your action follows from the decision. And indeed, at the time that the plane was down, it was clearly not dangerous anymore. But if it was indeed an enemy plane, then it had to be downed, and you had to do it as soon as possible. So one could imagine, and I remember discussing this with Amos and saying we were aware of how unrealistic our view was, but that from the point of the decision analysis, what the Chief of Staff should be worried about is at what probability of this being an enemy, a dangerous plane, will he decide to shoot it, given that, to shoot it down, given that the alternative is to shoot down a civilian plane. That clearly was not the way that it was done. What we see here, and this is very, very common, is a complete mixture of desires and beliefs, and the function of the decision maker is not only to do trade-offs, but the decision maker actually makes a judgment about the situation. The decision maker acts as an intelligence officer and makes a decision about the state of the world from which actual moves are made. This is profoundly different from the ideal of decision making. And when you stop to think about just that event, I think we were naive to believe that this can be changed, that this can be reformed. There are deep structural reasons for that kind of what I would call a big mistake in the quality of the decision. It is not an accident, and it's going to be very difficult to change. Now, researchers in decision-making, such as ourselves, accept the model of decision-making as choosing between gambles. And so psychological theory of decision-making is actually a theory of how people choose between gambles. Certainly that's the way that Amos and I approached it, and we developed such a theory. And in such a theory, we have those two elements, the values and the probabilities, or, if you will, the desires and the beliefs. And I will talk here about beliefs and about desires, mostly actually about beliefs. Now, what have we learned since 1973 that we didn't know then? Well, some of the things actually that we've just confirmed that everybody knows. But there has been a great deal of excellent research on people's ability and the ability of experts to forecast political and strategic events. And my friend and colleague Philip Petlock has been doing this kind of research for more than 15 years. There's a book about it now, in which he's been actually asking experts to make long-range predictions in a very highly systematic way, collecting a lot of information about these experts, waiting for the events actually to come out, so he has some predictions that are 10, 15 years old, and then confronting people with what they predicted and with what happened then, and recording how they think about, as it turns out, the very numerous mistakes that they made. Now, the overwhelming conclusion of this research is that people are awful at making predictions about political and strategic events. There are just many, many, many errors that people make. And the very striking combination is the combination of relatively high confidence that people have in their judgments and the decision makers have in the actions that they take on the basis of their judgments, and the very low accuracy of these judgments when you follow through. Another conclusion, which is quite remarkable actually, is that there seems to be very little expertise in political and strategic decision making. That is, there is a basic level of expertise of the reader, say, of the Haaretz or the New York Times, and beyond that, regional experts, they're much better at explaining what happened, but they're not much better at predicting what will happen than just the basic information that filters through, except in unusual situations like, a new revolution that happened in a place that was stable, then they're very quickly able to understand the situation better than others. But by and large, one of the major conclusions of this research, and I believe it is quite true, is that people are not terribly good at this. They're much less good than they think they are, and expertise, even expertise, is not a prediction. But I will have something to say about this. Now, Pitlock has looked very hard for ways to predict whether there are good forecasters and bad forecasters. And one of the ways that he looked was to try to classify people by their ideologies, or conservatives, or liberals, and that's the polarity in the United States. Can you specify in terms of ideology who is more accurate? And that's a complete failure, actually. Ideology had nothing to do with the accuracy of prediction. He did find quite a striking variation in accuracy, and all of this is in the context of relatively low accuracy. But what he found was that there is a cognitive style that is associated with higher accuracy. And the distinction that Pitlock relied on, a distinction drawn by Isaiah Berlin between two types of cognitive style or two types of thinking, and Isaiah Berlin distinguished between hedgehogs who know one large thing and foxes who know many small things. And Pitlock constructed a scale which allows him to classify experts as hedgehog-likes or fox-likes, and the foxes do much better than the hedgehogs in prediction. That is, much better, still not well. But people who know one big thing, don't ask them to predict the future, because they're not very good at it. And so ideology seems to get in the way, especially ideology combined with and this is not a correlate of intelligence. This is not, being a hedgehog is not being simple-minded. But it's a way of of thinking that is informed by one large thought or one large idea. Now, one puzzle that arises, from this major finding that people find it so difficult to predict the future, why do they go on trying to do it? That is, and why do we keep making forecasts? And why do we make these forecasts with considerable confidence? And there are a couple of reasons and a couple of explanations. And one of them, I think Amos and I knew a long time ago. And one of them I've learned recently, I think, from Pitlock again. Now, people learn very little from their mistakes, because once something happens, it immediately becomes obvious that it had to happen. This is called the Hindside effect, and it was first studied in Jerusalem in a PhD thesis by Baal Fischoff that became a classic. And the phrase that we used then to describe it was that the handwriting was on the wall. It was an invisible ink until the event happened, and then you see it on the wall. And that's the hindsight phenomenon. But there is something else that Pitlock has been studying, and which I think is extremely instructive. And this has to do with counterfactual thinking. That is, it's what people think about the events that didn't happen, and about what would have happened if the situation had been different from what it actually turned out to be. Now, that turns out to be absolutely basic. And it turns out that people vary a great deal about the counterfactuals that they hold true, and that their beliefs about counterfactuals are held with such confidence that they actually anchor their continued confidence in their ability to predict the future. Let me give you some examples of that. The stories that people construct about what might have happened but didn't are essential in maintaining the stability of beliefs, and they're almost entirely unconstrained. Now, Tetlock has been studied, spent a lot of work on the analysis by conservators and people on the left of the fall of the Soviet Empire. And did the Reagan military buildup contribute to the fall of the Soviet Empire? Or did it retard it, or might it have caused the empire not to fall? And it turns out that there are large differences in people's beliefs about what would have happened if Reagan had not conducted a large military buildup. And some people believe it would have been terrible, and other people believe it would have been wonderful. This is highly predictable from their ideology. People are absolutely convinced that they're right. It enables them to assign causal responsibilities to events. The causes that we assign to events depend on the counterfactual that we construct. Now, obviously, something very much like this is going on today. So Abu Mazen has resigned, and now what would have happened if, say, there had been more American pressures, Israel had been more forthcoming, they had actually stopped the settlements, what have you. We can have counterfactuals. Everybody here has very strong beliefs about these points, and these beliefs are highly revealing about our general ideology, and we don't change these beliefs very easily. That is, people hang on to their counterfactuals, and the counterfactuals tend to be stable, even though reality is all over the place. The counterfactuals that people construct enable them, when they're wrong, to feel that they were almost right. And this is a recipe for learning as little as possible from the surprises that we inevitably encounter when we try to predict the future. Okay, so that's one of the things that I think we didn't know that we know now, and which helps resolve that very strange puzzle of the level of confidence with which the debate about the future is held, coupled with the very low accuracy of this debate. Now let me briefly talk about another phenomenon in the domain of beliefs, which I think is highly relevant to strategic decisions. And in psychology, it's called the fundamental attribution error. And the fundamental attribution error is how we think about other people as actors. That is, we have an individual performing certain acts, an individual or an organization or a nation performing certain acts. We have a very strong tendency to believe that what people, organizations, and nations do reflects their true nature. It is inherent in their nature to behave as they behave. We don't think that about ourselves. That is, when we think about what we do, we tend to think of ourselves as reacting in a very flexible way to the events as they are. But the other people are not reacting. The other people are expressing their real nature. It turns out that this is a major effect in individual decision-making, and you probably can see it playing out, not only there, but you can also see it playing out in the newspaper. That is, how we think about ourselves, how we think about other people, and how easy it is to think about what we are doing as a reaction to what other people are doing, compared to the enormous difficulty of seeing what the other side is doing as a reaction to what we are doing. One of these is much more natural than the other, and it's a deep psychological effect that is extremely difficult to uproot. Decision analysts are going to have a hard time with the fundamental attribution error. It is not going to go away very easily. By the way, the fundamental attribution error is always present in personal quarrels. When there is a personal quarrel that escalates, typically both sides feel that they have no choice. They just have to respond to the provocation. They're merely reacting to what the other person is doing. Another error, by the way, that is associated with that I think is clearly established in social psychology at the individual level, but I would submit that it's characteristic of our thinking about larger issues as well, is an error of transparency. It's a fallacy of transparency. That is, it's the sense that regardless of what we're actually doing, if our intentions are good, the other side is bound to know that our intentions are good. And this fallacy of feeling that your good intentions are transparent and that the other side is not reacting but expressing its true nature are very much in the way of thinking properly under situations of conflict. And they just create a huge bias in the way that we tend to think in personal quarrels and in national quarrels as well. Now, this is a very complex issue. The conditions under which we feel that we actually are free and have initiative, or the conditions under which we feel that we're merely reacting to the others, I won't do justice to this topic here, but what I have said, I think, can be. Now, I have, on the basis of these reasons, that is, wrong beliefs, poor forecast, systematic errors in the understanding of ourselves and of the errors, we know then that the basis on which we make important decisions is rather poor in terms of our assignment of probabilities. I think the inaccuracy of forecasts has implications for a theory about why people, individuals, and nations take risks. And I will provide you with a very simple theory of why risks are taken. And of course, there is more than one explanation, and if you believe in the rational agent model, you think that people take risks because they have a realistic idea of the probabilities and of the values. I will propose an alternative theory, and this is that many times when people or organizations or nations take risks, it's because they don't know the risks that they're taking. They're simply deluded. I mean, there is delusional optimism as the basis as a major basis and a major reason for a great deal of the risk-taking that actually goes on. Now, this can be, this answer is embarrassingly simple, but I believe there is a great deal of evidence that supports it. We certainly have evidence for optimism, one of the major cognitive biases that dominates a great deal of thinking. Let me give you an example from the world of business. Starting a small business is very risky, at least in the United States, in the sense that the 5-year survival rate for a small business is about 30%. So somebody who starts a small business has a chance of about 1/3 of surviving for 5 years and 2/3 of failing and folding. Do people who start small businesses know this? And the answer is, of course they don't. When you actually study people who start small businesses, they are pretty sure they will succeed. Some of them are absolutely sure they will succeed. They can't even imagine not succeeding. So the reason that they take those decisions is that they just don't know the odds that they're facing, which makes them very comfortable, actually, with taking those decisions. They feel that they're being prudent and reasonable. They're just wrong. And how do we know this? Well, and what implications does it have? The implications for conflict are, I think, really quite significant. And, let me cite one study. You have people engaged in an exercise of arbitration. It's a study by Max Besemann and some colleagues. You have people engaged in an exercise of arbitration which has the following form. And it's called final offer arbitration, so that the people ultimately at the end of the arbitration process, each side makes a complete offer, a solution to the problem, and the arbiter has one move. The arbiter picks either this offer or that offer. Very simple. Now you ask people, what is the probability that your offer will be taken? Now, if people are being completely rational and unbiased, the sum of these probabilities should add up to 100%. It adds up to roughly 140%. That is, people think that they're right. They think that the arbiter will see that they're obviously right. They also think, I think, in many military conflicts, I mean, my impression, when you look at military conflicts, I propose that as a hypothesis, there is optimism of generals and military leaders on at least one side, and quite possibly, in many cases, on both sides. And that the reason that the conflict does take place is because people do not consider the real probabilities of the actual outcomes. I don't believe there is a lot of discussion these days about what the Japanese thought before Pearl Harbor. And, some people say they were not all that optimistic. But just try to think about a Japanese general at the time of Pearl Harbor thinking that this was going to end after untold suffering and death in unconditional service. Do you really think that there was significant probability, realistic probability assigned to that outcome when they decided on their move? And the answer is almost certainly not. By the way, it is also the case that if there had been a general, he would probably have been shot or invited to commit harakiri if he had expressed that kind of belief, because it would be considered disloyal to have doubts in your ability to prevail. And that creates a great deal of complexity. So, how do we know this? Well, and what does it relate to? We know that people exaggerate their skills. So that's a lot of documentation on that. Let me give you a thought experiment. Look around you. Everybody here drives. And suppose that there was a test about the quality of driving. And everybody in this room would be ranked by the quality of their driving. Now, and then we divided, the top 10%, the next 10%, and so on, down to the last 10%. Now, where do you think you fit in the distribution of drivers? Now, I won't conduct this test, but I can tell you the results because that's been done many times. About 85 to 90% of you think you're above average. That is, you think you're above the median. Now, actually, there are exactly 50% of you above the median, so 40% of you are wrong. You're actually below the median, and you think you're above the median. And in some cases, this can be quite significant, that kind of error. And it's been demonstrated in many contexts, in the context of driving, but in many other contexts that matter more. So people exaggerate their skill. They also exaggerate the degree of their control over situations. And that has a great deal to do with the reason, with why decision makers dislike this image of taking gambles. Decision makers don't feel that they're gamblers. They feel that they're the captain of a ship in the stormy sea. They control events, and their skill is in controlling events. And they tend to exaggerate the extent of their events. Here again, the research that I know about is more research on the business side than on the political side, but I wouldn't be surprised if the same extended. When in business, you have a group that is developing a particular product, and it's a novel product, and you ask them, what do they think their chances of success in the marketplace are, and they exaggerate those chances. And you also ask them, what does it depend on? And what they focus on are things that they can do. Now, as it happens, in the business place, the success of a new product depends just about as much on the competition as it does on your own efforts. So if somebody else is developing a similar product and it's marginally better, you're likely to fail even if you do extremely well. This is a phenomenon that's actually been named. It's called competitive neglect. I mean, it's just not thinking about the other side because you're so much focused on the degree to which you control events. And that is part of optimism. So optimistic biases violate the basic separation of beliefs from desires, which is an essential aspect of rationality and an essential recommendation of decision analysis. And for that reason alone, we need decision analysis, but probably for that reason as well, we're not going to get it, although we need it. Beliefs about the futures are markedly influenced by desires, by hopes, and by fears. In the organizational context, you can ask, well, what would the separation of beliefs from desires require? Well, that's the example I gave of the Downing-Bilibien plane. It would require a separation of intelligence from evaluation, and that is totally unrealistic. As it happens, the decision makers don't accept this separation. They make their own forecasts and their own decisions, and there is a way in which they're absolutely right, because ultimately they are held responsible for the judgments. They're held responsible for their probabilities because they're held responsible for the outcomes. And if the outcome was good, their judgment is considered to be good. So in terms of the incentives that decision makers would control the decision makers, it's very easy to understand why they reject that distinction. The result is that intelligence collection and the summary of intelligence is done informally and intuitively in the mind of one person. Now, you might think that, this happens in informal organizations, but it wouldn't happen in a big business. I was reading last week about how large organizations control risk, and there now is a large business organization. There is typically a risk officer and a whole risk department, and the goal of that department is to evaluate the risk that the organization is facing and to alert the various units of the organization to possible risks that they're running, and to assign probabilities to these risks. Microsoft has such a unit, and there was an interview with the director of the risk analysis unit of Microsoft, and he had the following revealing statement. He says, ultimately, Bill Gates is the major risk analyst in this organization. That defeats the whole purpose, of course, of having such a unit. If Bill Gates listens to them, that's fine. But if Bill Gates has his own problem separating his beliefs from his desires, I mean, there is no indication he does have big problems. But if he does, then he is quite free to act on his own intuitions. I have just a few more things to say about beliefs. And I want to highlight the difficulty that people have in thinking seriously about uncertainty. Decision analysts assume that we're able to assign numerical probabilities to events. And if you can't assign numerical probabilities, you really cannot do decision analysis as it is meant to be done. But people have a great deal of trouble with that. Let me give you an example of a lovely experiment done by Paul Fischoff that I mentioned earlier and some other colleagues. You tell people that there is a virus, that is, we're expecting flu virus, and you describe the symptoms of that virus, and you tell people there is a 10% probability that you will contract this virus, and then you spend a week in bed with chills and fevers and so on. How much would you pay for a vaccine? And people would tell. Now, there is another condition under which you tell people there is a virus, and there's a 20% probability that you'll be infected, and there is a vaccine, but the vaccine is not effective for everybody. All it does is it reduces the probability of your having the flu from 20% to 10%. How much would you pay for the virus? And you probably feel that this just isn't worth much compared to the first one. Now, here is the third one. There are two viruses, virus A and virus B, and you have a 10% probability of getting the flu from virus A and a 10% probability of getting the flu from virus B, and the symptoms are the same. We unfortunately have a vaccine only for virus A. How much would you pay for that vaccine? People buy that vaccine, they pay just as much for that vaccine as they paid for the first one. Now notice, both cases, the probability goes down from 20% to 10%. One of them is just worth very little, and the other, we feel we've done something. We've eliminated virus A. If we think that way, we're not doing anything that is remotely similar to decision analysis. Now, 30 years ago, in the Leer Institute, I talked about a related error. And the error was, a problem. And the problem is, which were the problem people were very occupied with at that time, do you give up strategic territory in the Sinai? And now there is one thing and we're talking now about one consequence, the probability of a military defeat for the state of Israel. And now there is an absolute certainty that the probability of defeat will be increased if there is a war by giving up strategic assets. That's a sure thing. On the other side, there is a possibility or a probability that if you give up those assets, the probability that there will be a war will diminish. Clearly, the probability of a defeat is the product of these two probabilities, that there will be a war and that you will not prevail in that war. But notice that one of these looks very solid and the other one looks weak. And in terms that, and thinking of now, there is a rhetorical advantage for the hawks in this debate, for the people who do not want to give up strategic assets, because they're talking of something that is probabilistic in a way, but it's a sure, it looks like a sure thing. It's like a vaccine for virus A. We call that pseudo-certainty. It's the sense, it's an illusory certainty that people can develop in an uncertain world. And notice that you can predict the direction of the bias. That is, you can predict how a discussion along those lines is likely to develop, because one of the sides is much more comfortable in this argument than the other. Okay. When we talk about the risk that people take, and some risks are particularly heavy, and some errors count for much more than other errors. And that, again, is something that we see in the rhetoric of the debate. And we see it at the level of the individuals, and I think we see it at the national levels. The error of trusting too much is worse than the error of trusting too little. Being gullible, being taken advantage of, is something that people just absolutely hate. And they would rather make the mistake. I mean, all of us, this is not the dominion of anyone in particular. All of us, by and large, are biased against that error. And we see that in a great many experiments currently being done on interactions between players, that the role of the fear of being taken for a sucker, of being made a sucker, of being taken advantage of the other side just manipulating you, is a fear that is ever present in people's mind, and the opportunities that they miss by not reaching agreements, by not trusting the other, tend to loom much less large in people's minds. Okay. I've talked exclusively about beliefs. I will say a few words about values, because I'm taking too long. We have learned a great deal on the value side. And one of the things that we have learned is the way that people think about outcomes. And they think about outcomes in a way that is fundamentally different from what certain analysis suggests should be the proper way of thinking about outcomes. Let me tell you what the proper way of thinking about outcomes should be. And it's, you think about a final state, when all the uncertainty is resolved, the gamble has been played, it's at least in 10 years. You look at the various options of what the final states would look like, and then you evaluate those. That tends not to be the way that people think. The way that people think about outcomes is they tend to think in terms of what they get, what they give up. We tend to think in terms of changes, gains, and losses, and not in terms of final states. I'll describe one experiment very briefly because I think it has pretty obvious implications for the topic of tonight. Here is the experiment. You come to a room like this with a set of objects that would be pretty objects. In the United States, for those experiments with a population of students, we would use decorated mugs. So those are mugs, say, with a university symbol on it, good-looking mugs. So what we do in the experiment, we would, in an obviously random way, give mugs, say, to half of you. So half of you get mugs, half of you don't get mugs. All of you get a questionnaire. Now your questionnaire, if you got a mug, is formulated as follows. The mug is yours. You can go home with it. But you can also exchange it for money. So you could ask, and now we would like you to commit yourself to what you will do, and this is actually for real. We play those games and pay people and give them mugs and so on. If we give you $10, do you want to keep the mug or to get the $10? $50, $9, all the way down to 50 cents. Okay? But they determine basically the price at which they will sell the mug. We ask the other people questionnaire says, look at your neighbor's mug. Now, you could get a mug just like that, or you could get money. Now, if we offer you $10, would you like to get the money or the mug? If we offer you $9.50, $9, and so, what would you like? Now, notice the following. The situation of sellers and the choosers, as we call them, is identical in terms of the real options that they face. They can go home with a mug, or they can go home with money. And all they're telling you is the amount of money that makes them indifferent. That and the mug. It turns out people do not set the same price. When they have the mug, they demand twice as much money as the mug is worth when they're just looking at it as something to be gained. Now, what's the difference? The difference is that people do not really think of having a mug. You don't think of a mug as something that you'll be drinking coffee out of, of the long-term circumstances. What people think of in that experiment is what it feels like to have a mug and give it up. And the other people just look at the mug completely differently. So they could get the mug or they could get the money. Giving up is painful. And that's enough. And we actually know pretty much by how much giving up is more painful than getting with it. And the ratio in many experiments is roughly 1 in the mugs. It's 2 to 1 in many other situations. A couple of weeks ago, I saw a study on happiness. And the effects of unhappiness of a change in your income relative to last year. And for a study was done in Germany for the same difference in marks, the effect of a loss of income is twice as large as the effect of a gain of income. So you suffer more if you lose than you enjoy if you get, and that ratio is about 2 to 1. Think of the implications of that for negotiations. What happens in negotiations is that the concessions that we make are losses to us. The concessions that the other side makes are gains to us. So the concessions that we make are already right off the bat worth twice as much as the concessions we get. That's the gap that has to be bridged for an agreement to be reached in a difficult negotiation. And this phenomenon that we call loss aversion is a major obstacle in reaching actual agreement in a state of conflict and negotiation. And again, it is something that is going to be extremely difficult to overcome by decision analysis. So, let me bring this to a close and sort of review what is the argument that I've tried to sketch here. I have sketched, and in a way you could say this is the major thing or the most useful thing that I've done. I've sketched an idealized model of what decision making ought to be like, certainly for important decisions. We would want to think in terms of final states. We would want a dispassionate evaluation of the probable outcomes of different options on the final state. We would want that evaluation to be done by foxes and not by hedgehogs. And we would want very serious thinking about the trade-offs and a separation of the trade-offs from the probabilities. I don't think we're going to get this. And what I was saying was there are structural reasons why decision analysis hasn't taken on. I still think that it's an ideal worth striving for, but it is also quite significant to realize how far we are from that ideal and how difficult it would be to actually achieve a higher level of decision making on important decisions, and how difficult it is going to be to avoid large mistakes in important decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Kahneman, Professor Kahneman. We have an option. And we don't know how we are gambling by that one. There is a risk in it. And the risk is that you don't like it, that we have to give it to you anyhow, because it's a proof that you have told Oscar from the lecture.
Thank you. very little risk.
This brings the formal part to an end. There is some drinks and helpings outside, and we will be happy to have you join. Thank you very much.